And we're live for episode 224 of Trek Live. How you doing this fine Sunday, Dan?
Doing really great. Excited to talk about some really great episodes to introduce to a newcomer. So I'm excited for it.
Unfortunately. We'll see if it clears up and then maybe go from there. So we've done versions of this. A lot of people have done versions of this across different shows, but I don't know that we ever have here on Trek Live. This is kind of aiming at coinciding with opening weekend for Major League Baseball with the starting nine idea. We're going to go with 9 slots, the same way a baseball team has 9 slots in its lineup. That also kind of introduces some opportunities for some additional rules for why certain episodes might fit in certain slots. We have 3 categories that we're going to kind of use to think about which episodes we would include. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it should be fun. I know I could tell Dan was having a little internet trouble. I don't know if you heard me a couple minutes ago. So we'll be on our toes and see how that goes. But it's been okay for the last couple minutes, so we might be okay. But before we get into that, get into our lineups, let's cover our rewatches. We're separated by a few episodes at this point. You have a little bit left of season 4. I'm a few episodes into season 5. How's your rewatch going?
It's going pretty good, actually. I think really settling into season 4. I think pretty decent little run, if I had to say so myself. At least kind of in the middle of season 4 here. Mm-hmm. So like Identity Crisis, Cupid, Drumhead. Those are the kind of last 3 or 4 that I went through that I think are actually pretty solid and are do some really cool stuff. It's nice to see like TNG really, climb into like TNG proper, where it's like, oh, this episode is really heavily focused on Geordi and he's getting a lot more this season. But I think there's definitely an ensemble feel to it, but there's also like this character episode. So it's a definitely solid little run. There are some missteps I think here and there, but at least for my money, it's pretty solid.
Yeah, we mentioned last time we were here. Our last episode was like a season 3 kind of wrap up, where we did our rankings and talked about that season through the lens of our rewatch. But season 4 is a little different than season 3 in the sense that I think what we often talk about when we do like fantasy drafts, it gets really interesting once you're through the undisputed kinds of classics. And I think season 3 might have a few more of that kind of episode, the undisputed classics that are very often talked about. Season 4 might have a few less of them, and maybe a wider pool of episodes that are very good, very strong, but might not be as often mentioned. Things like the kind of run you were just on, the Nth Degree, Cupid, Identity Crisis, Galaxy's Child. Like once you get through, the Best of Both Worlds and Family and the Drumhead, now you're into some more, I think, territory where you're going to get more quickly into like personal preference and taste. The Wounded, Data's Day, Brothers, things like that you don't see on top 10 lists as often. But I think depending on your kind of individual taste and what you love about Trek might create some difference in lists. So I'm really looking forward to being able to talk more about season 4 once you're through it, and maybe we can look at our lists and see what differences we might have. I suspect we're often pretty close, but I think season 4 there might be just a better chance at some more subtle differences, just because of the variety of episodes and the kinds of episodes they are. I really like season 4 for that reason.
Yeah, I think just the way that the episodes are, I think we're definitely going to have a little bit a difference in opinion, at least from season 3, I think. So I'm excited for it.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely get into that in the next couple of weeks. We have some topics that we're really excited about in the next handful. So I'm not sure where we'll do it and how it'll fit, or how we might deliver it, but we'll definitely do at least a segment or a whole episode on rankings for season 4 in the near future. At the end of this, we're also going to cover our quick thoughts on the last couple episodes of Picard. Since we've been here, we've gotten 6 and 7, The Bounty and Dominion. Some interesting things to unpack there. So we'll wrap up with that once we're through our lineups and through the meat of our topic here. So stay tuned for that if you're a Picard fan and keeping up with what's going on there. Cool. So I think we'll get into it. I have a little Word document that I did up so that we can kind of throw up on our screen, and for the folks watching on YouTube here, a little visual aid since we're going to be naming off 9 episodes each. We might have some overlap too. There's no rule here. It's not a fantasy draft, so that we may have some duplicate choices. There's no rule against that. I'd be surprised if we have a ton of it. There might be some, but I guess we'll find out here in a few minutes. I think the way we're going to do this is we're going to go one section at a time. The first couple of slots are intro materials. So in other words, episodes that really function well as like a what is Star Trek. Get the basics out. What are the top of the lineup kinds of things that you would want to start somebody off with. The heavy hitters 3 through 6 are 4 episodes that are more of the classic variety, the episodes that are often cited at the top of lists and are frequent favorites that you'd want to get into right in the heart of the order. And then we're going to tail it off with 7 through 9 as personal choices, personal picks, episodes that might be a little off the beaten path, or they might still be very frequently cited favorites, but episodes that speak to us personally, episodes that are personal favorites for whatever reasons. You want to choose things here that really speak to your fandom, episodes that kind of demonstrate what keeps you coming back to Trek. So we'll kind of flip back and forth in those 3 sections to kind of keep it rolling with the little variety, and really looking forward to seeing what we have. Any intro thoughts, Dan, on the topic and how you kind of came up with your list? Anything that you?
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna play with the like each, I think, grouping. I'm definitely gonna play with but like specifically like 3 through 6. Bill said like, oh, this is like cited as the best. Like I'm trying to like. I think each list can kind of vary. I think, especially when you're introing someone different, like the list may be different depending on who you're introing.
No doubt.
And so I think for me, I'm trying to introduce Star Trek, right, with the intro materials. Like those players are usually like a person who can get on base no matter what the pitcher, no matter what the weather, that's going to be successful no matter who's watching. Mm-hmm. But I think for the heavy hitters specifically, they're going to be great episodes. Obviously, a lot of these are great episodes. Spoiler alert! I thought about doing like a Spock's Brain, like, oh, this is kind of like a cult following classic where you have water. We're not doing that this morning. But for me, I'm trying to like, it's going to be Star Trek, but it's going to be trying to capture most of the shows without being too complicated with getting into the jargon of like, you got to know this and that and this and that. And so it's like, I'm trying to do that. So with the heavy hitters specifically, I'm trying to, it's not going to be like this is not going to be a top 9 episode for me of Star Trek. This is going to be like episodes that I think represent each show very well. And I think it's not too complicated where I'm like, okay, this, like in Enterprise specifically, it's like it's so hard to explain to a newcomer. Like, okay, it's before this, before that. Yeah. This is the person. So this is where I kind of stick to like a traditional, like you don't really have to know much to kind of see these episodes. So I'm really excited to jump into something like this. But that's just my list and how it's going to be kind of structured and formatted.
I echo a lot of that. I try to definitely, you have to take into account whenever you do one of these kinds of topics. You know, unless you have a very specific person in mind and you're really aiming, like if, in your case, if you're aiming at your wife, you would have maybe a little bit of a different, like that's a specific kind of approach. This is a more generic, obviously, you know. And when you do that, I guess the beauty of that is when it is generic and unspecified, you probably have the most opportunity to create some variety and touch on different shows and different kinds of episodes. Than maybe having a specific person in mind that you're kind of tailoring it to. That's a whole different thing. So I did the same thing. I'm thinking of a kind of generic person that, you know, I maybe not know that much about in terms of their personal tastes. I also kind of wanted to make sure I had some variety. I'm trying not to choose too heavily from any one show. I wanted to try to get a sample size from across the 50 some years of content, new, old, in between. But definitely, I think it's important, something that is always a challenge with this kind of approach when you start thinking about what would you use to introduce somebody and you're kind of picking and prodding through those 50 some years, is you got to look for episodes that don't require a ton of baggage coming in. Like there are a ton of great episodes. Like maybe my favorite, you know, my favorite episode is The City on the Edge Forever, but right on its tail is Yesterday's Enterprise. And I don't know how well that works for somebody that might not have a lot of, you know, preordained knowledge, or at least it kind of numbs the impact of it. So, you know, there are episodes that don't fit the bill as well here, as opposed to like what are your favorite episodes kind of discussion. So yeah, that's major focus.
And I put those in personal picks. Like I really don't think we should really lead off with anything in the 1960s, is my opinion. I think that like people, like most people coming to Trek, I think, are not gonna be able to get past the you know, the production design value, and the production value and stuff like that. I honestly think I can. I don't know. I'd love to have a discussion about it, but I do not think anybody's going to get into the 1960s.
Sounds like maybe you have some personal experience with trying. And
yes.
I have tried. Yeah. I too have had some personal experience with that. We'll see if I abided by that rule or not in a couple minutes here. But I definitely agree that is an uphill battle, you know, for some folks. And that's, again, a big part of like knowing your audience. If you know who you're talking about or who you're aiming at, you know, TOS might kind of get short shrift pretty quickly if you know who you're aiming at, and if you know that those kinds of things might present more of a challenge to a given person than maybe somebody else. So TOS is an interesting thing to take into account as well, because of just the age of the show, and not just the production values, but it's a show from the 60s, so there are sensibilities in there that, you know, might rub somebody the wrong way if they're not familiar, if they're not used to watching content from that era. But yeah, I'm sure we'll get into that as we go. It'll be interesting to see how many episodes from each show kind of get chosen here, where our kind of focuses are, and kind of talk more about those differences as we go and wrap up. But I think we're going to start with you, with your intro materials episodes, or choices. What would you go right out of the gate with for your 1 and 2 slots?
Again, I'm going with an episode that can definitely just like get on base, be successful no matter who's watching. I'm going with Yesterday's Enterprise. Bill mentioned it at the top of the show. I think the sci-fi-ness of us, I think, at least now, I feel like everybody has a greater understanding of like time travel and stuff like that.
Multiverses.
But I think it does what Star Trek does best. It's like it does have these great action scenes. It does have this really big sci-fi concept, but it's like it has like the thinking man's Star Trek is like, what would you do in that situation? And you're thinking about that 2-3 days after the episode, and I think that is what Star Trek is. It's got that sci-fi element, it's got that action element, it's got this dramatic element to it, but it's also got this like I'm just questioning, like, what would I do in that situation? So yeah, that's my number one.
I love it. I mean, I know I said right out of the gate I probably wouldn't do that, just because. But you're so right that, you know, a lot of the time I think of things like the multiverse, different timelines. You know, how does that all work? But I do think because of Marvel and some of the things that, you know, that franchise has done, and how mainstream science fiction and fantasy kinds of things have become, that, you know, maybe it's not as tall of a leap as maybe it was 15, 20 years ago to like have people wrap their heads around how this happens, and, you know, just making sense of the science fiction of it all. I mean, the movie that just won Best Picture was all about multiverses, and that wouldn't have happened a few years ago, I don't think. So, yeah, I mean, I do think.
I don't think we would have this great Marvel franchise without Star Trek.
You're right. I think you're right.
Honest.
Yeah. I think you're right. And Yesterday's Enterprise does have it all. I mean, there's a reason that I have it so high up on my list. It's dramatic and emotional, and it has all the action that you would want to like sell somebody on. That you get all these different like flavors. It's all kind of packaged into that episode. So on a lot of levels, I do think it works. It looks good. Like it's got visual effects. It's well shot. It's you know. I think there are a lot of hooks in it that I think could grab somebody for sure. I wonder about the Tasha Yar of it all. Like, does that land if you don't know? Like, I've always held back on that one just because of like I guess in my mind, like, I'd rather somebody hit that one if they got into it and landed on it later. But if you don't hook them right out of the gate, they're never going to get there. So like, I guess you kind of have to shoot your shot early to hopefully, you know, get them to be invested to want to see more. So I love it. I love it. What's your number two? What's following up?
Okay, number two is going to be a little bit of a deep cut, I think, but I think we just got to like cannonball in.
Sure.
I'm going to go with The Void from Enterprise. Or not Enterprise, sorry.
Voyager.
Voyager. Because I think it's such like just a really small sample size of what the Federation really is about. Like, you don't really like it's hard to kind of introduce someone to like what is the Federation and what is this core thing in Star Trek. But I think it's the best things of Star Trek. It's like the Federation, like a bunch of different entities coming together to work for a common goal. And I think again, there's things in it that like you're thinking about 2 or 3 days after. So.
I love it. I think in your first 2 episodes, you're kind of selling somebody on, in Yesterday's Enterprise, the fact that Trek is this giant timeline where there's lineage and history and, you know, things that happened years ago matter. Like this is a real place, a real future. And then The Void, I think, does kind of spell out through these discussions that, you know, Janeway and Chakotay and these new aliens that they're meeting. You know, what is the Federation? What's its mission statement? Why do they do the things that they do? Why do they not do other things? So, you know, right out of the gate, you're kind of, you know, instilling those 2 kind of key elements. You know, what's the vibe of Trek in terms of like how this giant universe works, and the kind of rules of the Federation. I think are emphasis is right out of the gate, and that's a really cool way to start. So I love it. So for me, I'm going to start not with an episode, but with a movie, because I feel like for an intro, I think it's kind of time tested at this point. I'm going with Star Trek 2009. I think it's
okay.
I think you know, for somebody, if you're really dealing with somebody who's never seen it before, and you know, it has very, very little familiarity with what Trek is, I still kind of stand by the easiest path to kind of introducing the key elements. You know, trying to translate things like the transporter is cool and warp drive is cool and Vulcans and Romulans and Klingons, like all the kind of most basic elements, phasers. I think '09 probably, because of the just nature and the mission statement of what that movie is, does the best job. I think it's the most clean entry point, other than just starting at the beginning, you know, by its obvious intention. And there are a lot of folks out there who that it was their intro. You know, I think you can make a case that the majority of people that you might be starting off on Trek, you know, the thing that is possible that they may have seen already outside of, you know, anything else, that may be the thing that people who might not be that into it might have stumbled into on TV or maybe saw in the theater back in the day. But I do like it as an introduction point for those who haven't seen it, just because of how intentionally it's kind of teeing up all the key elements. And like you mentioned, I mean, depending on the person's sensibility, you know, the modern production elements, the production values, you know, I feel like starting with something that does have a little bit more of a modern sensibility might offer more opportunities for hooks for like the generic person. Obviously not everybody's the same. Some people might gravitate more to the old school approach and the more throwback nature of it with TOS or TNG. But yeah, I think I think that's where I'm going to go to start. What do you think?
That's a great pick. I just think that it's definitely, it does a great job. It's what pushed me over into kind of, I had seen Voyager before that, but it's what pushed me over into kind of the Star Trek fandom. So it's a really great pick.
And then from there, I'm going to go and break your rule, just like you kind of broke mine with yesterday's Enterprise. I kind of right out of the gate said I probably wouldn't do that, and you did it and made a good case for it. I'm going to go with Devil in the Dark in my intro materials and go right to TOS and kind of intentionally build from 09 with Kirk, Spock, McCoy, that cast of characters, and kind of roll right into the kind of OG version of those same folks, and hope that, you know, the more modern take of 09 and hopefully the intrigue of wanting to know more about those characters would make a leap to TOS maybe a little easier. And I'm going with the Devil in the Dark because I think it's the classic, you know, science fiction morality, twisty turny kind of what's in the DNA of Star Trek that I think would lend itself well as like a, you know, if you can get down with this kind of storytelling and this kind of, you know, classic kind of morality dilemma, you know, quagmire, then you're probably going to be good with Trek. This is a like kind of test balloon for what a lot of Star Trek is going to do. I toyed a lot. I see Jeff in the room, and he mentioned the Corbomite maneuver. I've often said that I think that's like the what is Star Trek in a single episode kind of thing. So for a long time over the last couple of days while I put this list together, that was in that slot. But I just think, as much as I love the Corbomite maneuver, I think the Devil in the Dark might operate a little better as like a hooking device. So I'm going to go with that. Thoughts other than, I know you would probably veer more away from the original show.
It's definitely a great episode, and I think it's got Star Trek to its core. Yeah. But I think the tough sell that I have is the production value of it. Sure. So that's my only.
I hear you.
Caveat with something like TOS, at least this early on. I'm not saying like, hey, let's keep TOS off our lineups here.
Right.
Like, there is a place for some of these players, i.e., episodes, in our lineups. I just think maybe deeper in the lineup might be better.
You could very well be right, and I totally agree that depending on, if I knew who this was for, if I knew who I was aiming at, this would be a different list for each individual person that it could be for. This is definitely the generic kind of, all things being equal take for me. But I'm a big Devil in the Dark proponent. I know it's an episode that you see a lot, like when you see Twitter kinds of conversations or social media conversations more generically, like, what got you into Trek? What's the first thing you remember seeing? Devil in the Dark comes up a lot. You know, the Spock mind melding with the Horta is so weird and so like such a bizarre thing. If you don't, that even if you're like not immediately sold on it, it's going to grab you because of the way Nimoy plays it, because of the kind of just inherent wackiness of it. You know, it's gonna hook you, like, at least to be interested to like watch what is he doing. Like, so it just, I feel like it's kind of baked into my DNA. My dad always talks about it being the thing that got him in. That's like a specific thing that he remembers being a young kid and seeing that on TV and being immediately kind of grabbed by that. And I've seen that exact anecdote shared by other folks over the years. So it must work for people. But I mean, yeah, depending on who it is, I think is a key element that you can't ignore. Real quick, I just want to say welcome, Grin Salem. I remember you. You mentioned that you haven't been here in a long time. You were a frequent viewer back in the day, and we appreciate you popping back in. You mentioned that you haven't watched Trek in a while either, and that this is kind of giving you some motivation and some a roadmap maybe to dive back in. And we love that. That's a great reason to be talking about this stuff. It's as effective maybe as a re-entry point kind of strategy as it is trying to hook somebody who's never seen it before. So awesome. Let's get into your heavy hitters. What kind of classic, heavy swinging power hitter kinds of choices did you go with here?
Well, I'm going with a movie, which I think is still technically an episode.
Oh, it sure is.
A longer episode. So I'm going with Voyage Home.
Nice.
I think this day and age, I think, again, this is another like time travel-y type of episode, but I think it for me, I think there's like a trope out there where it's like the arena trope where you have to fight this bad looking alien. It's like, no, so they can do really great things with just like this great sci-fi concept going back in time, trying to bring back these whales to this entity that has come in the future, which is but I think for me, I think you can definitely get on board with the time travel aspect of it, and then you're going back to kind of a familiar point in time where like you can recognize things, and it's not too old. It's not technically 1966 or 67 or whatever.
80s.
It's the 80s.
Yeah.
So it's definitely like everybody kind of remembers back in that time, and it's I think you can definitely get on board with the production value, obviously, because it's so big and does some really big things. And I really think you get the camaraderie of that crew. I think everybody has some great things to do, but you get really the definitely the aspect of each character in this episode. So yeah, it's my first heavy hitter, and I think it was fitting because we've got some people on base. And we're trying to swing for the fences now, and I think this episode, like, I thought about Star Trek 2, but it's like I feel like you need maybe a specific TOS episode for that one. So I went Voyage Home.
Yeah, I think that's an obvious great choice. I think prior to 2009, The Voyage Home was the most frequently cited. Like, maybe you're not a Star Trek fan, but what Star Trek have you seen? Well, the one with the whales, I think, is still, I think 2009 and that are the two that people know what that is. They've seen that. People who weren't Star Trek fans went to the theater to watch it and enjoyed it. It's financially successful, critically acclaimed. It's got all the traits of like, well, it's a good movie. So I think it'll work on a lot of people. You don't, it's clearly building off of 2 and 3, but it's so perfectly kind of constructed to not even really need any of that. Like if you have it, it's great and it helps, but it works on its own. It stands on its own. So I think for a topic like this, and given the history of that movie and the fact that it did work as an introductory point for so many people, that kind of makes the point for you as well, that it's kind of a time-tested and proven successful intro point. So I love it, and I do think it, the no villain, the no adversary kind of approach, the humor of it. Humor is an underrated element of Trek. Good Star Trek knows when to be funny and can incorporate that like human touch to its stories, and I think that's a key potential hook for people, that it's not all like gloom and doom, serious, heavy science fiction. That there's humor here too, and that the characters like each other and they get along, and there's a levity to it. So it's great. What's hitting cleanup? I think you're on mute there. There you go.
Cleanup. I'm gonna go with The Offspring.
Nice.
I just hit this. I think it does a really good job of really doing some dramatic stuff with some of the characters. It's got obviously a great sci-fi concept, but I think it's got a really tough emotional punch, which I'm going to be kind of dipping my toe in here with some of these episodes that's coming. But yeah, I just think that, and then it's just a really good episode. So yeah, going Offspring.
Can't argue with that. I think if you're looking for an emotional kind of heavy hitter, I don't know that there are any that hit heavier than The Offspring. I think it may or may not appear on my list at some point here, so I'll I'll leave it there. What about what's up in the number 5 slot?
Next, I'm going with Timeless from Voyager.
Sure.
Again, another timey-wimey type of episode, but I think a really strong cast has a lot to do with that. Really good production value in it. I think this can do some really fun stuff and really kind of dive into the more like sci-fi concept type of. I got a lot of time stuff on here.
You do,
but next is probably the toughest one of the bunch. I wanted to try to get a jumping off point for Deep Space Nine. So I'm going with Duet. I'm trying to figure out, and early on, it's tough with Deep Space Nine because I think there's so much good stuff with the introduction into serialization, but I think Duet is a good okay, this is kind of this is a different show. It's going to take it on some really tough topics and explore some really tough things. And I think if you're talking about Deep Space Nine, this is like how it starts is the relationship between the Federation folks down on Bajor, and then also Cardassians and stuff. So I think that's a really good jumping off point for Deep Space Nine. And I know it's like the Dominion War is really what I think people think of when they think of Deep Space Nine, but I think that's kind of hard to do with one episode. So yeah, that's my heavy hitters. Again, this is not a top 9 list. This is like episodes that I think really represent the show well, but also dabble the toe into some sci-fi concepts, and then also some emotional punches, which I think those last two, or not last two, but some of these episodes have some really good emotional punches too. So yeah, and they also don't kind of fall into like the tropiness of like going down to a planet and finding the Gorn or something like that. This is different. I'm trying to change people's perspectives on Star Trek and
Nice.
Get them introduced into some of these other shows like Voyager and Deep Space Nine.
I love it. I think Timeless has a lot of really potential alluring points. That crash sequence is really exciting and holds up really well from like a visual effects standpoint. I think there's a lot of emotion there. I think it works pretty well. Voyager's kind of tough, kind of like Deep Space Nine. You have to kind of explain, I guess, like this is a ship that's flung away and is trying to come back, and there's some key context to like what the premise of Voyager is and how it powers individual episodes. But I think Timeless, because it takes on that premise so head on, like they're trying to get home, and like you don't even necessarily need to know that. You can just kind of go along for the ride, and I think it tells you a lot about the crew, like the family of the crew, and it's a good advertisement for like the best of what Voyager is. And Duet will be on my list in like 2 minutes. So I'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
So I'll get into my heavy hitters. You'll notice maybe a little pattern kind of extending from the intro materials here with the flow of the shows. I'm going to go with for my number 3, an episode I just watched this weekend. I think an episode that kind of really represents the next generation in a nutshell is Darmok. I think, the putting Patrick Stewart in the forefront, kind of leaning into his performance as Picard. It's about communication. It's like a first contactee kind of a situation. And I just think it like nails the tone of what the next generation is at the heart of the next generation when you get into the core of the show, at its workmanlike, grinding episodes out, in the middle of the show kind of era. Great guest star, cool science fiction concept that has never really. I mean, you see versions of it in other Star Trek episodes where you put like a crewman, whether it's like Trip with an alien who you can't communicate with, but nothing's ever kind of come close to Darmok in terms of like getting to the core of like how do you talk to somebody like that doesn't speak your language, and like how do you get to the core of it, and leaning into that these are smart people who are advanced humans who are there for a reason with their intellect, and I think that's a key principle of Trek too. So I like that as an intro point for the next generation. Yesterday's Enterprise, what you chose, is obviously like a different flavor of the next generation with the science fiction action portion of it, which it certainly does in episodes like Hugh Who and The Best of Both Worlds, and Redemption, which I also just watched, where they do some really big epic kinds of things. But Darmok, I think, represents like the more intimate, humanist elements of Trek through the next generation pretty well.
Seems more like day to day versus like Enterprise is kind of like the big, or yesterday's Enterprise is kind of like the big. I get it, the great pick.
Heavy swing, yeah. So Duet, I'm going to go with next as my also kind of entry point into Deep Space Nine. I think like you said, Deep Space Nine is a really tough nut to crack for this because it's the serialized nature of it, the way the story builds over time. Deep Space Nine's best traits of like long range storytelling, stories that slowly build on each other. It makes it hard to like drop in once you get into the deeper points of the show. I don't know how well In the Pale Moonlight works as an intro point. An episode like Far Beyond the Stars, I think, could work for somebody as an intro point, but it's a little more anomalous for like what the Deep Space Nine is. I don't know that it's necessarily like it's a classic, and it's a great, perfect kind of test tube kind of what does Star Trek do best kind of message show. But I don't know that it embodies the grander, wide, long running Deep Space Nine serialized storytelling that I want to maybe emphasize too. So Duet, it's not introducing the Bajoran Cardassian dilemma, but it's really diving deeply into it, and it's doing it in a way that's so recognizably an allegory for human history, World War II, Nazi, Holocaust kinds of things, that I think there are easy hooks there for people who might struggle with the science fiction of things, but, might have an easier time finding the what's it really talking about in our own history kind of angle. And I think Duet does that as well as any, and it's just good drama. If a person's interested in like, if they just like a good drama, I don't think you could do better than Duet. It's two people, just tangoing for 45 minutes for the most part. So I think that's a good representation as well. So we agree there. That's our first on the page crossover. At least we have maybe
and I think especially too, like I think crime shows are also in, and so like the interrogation aspect of it too, I think would really help people kind of transition into, because like they're so popular these days that I think like even just like an episode like this where there's technically some investigation and some interrogation, I think it's easy to
procedural elements. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. My number 5 is going to be a Voyager choice that I think represents what Voyager does best. I'm going to go with Blink of an Eye for like a big science fiction, ambitious kind of concept. It's like I think that variety of Trek I haven't quite hit yet in my lineup. The high concept science fiction that you've kind of really gotten in yours with Yesterday's Enterprise, Timeless, the time travel kinds of things that represent that kind of side of Trek. This is my first kind of foray into that. And I think Voyager's a good vehicle for that flavor of Star Trek. I think it's a good ensemble piece. A lot of the characters in Voyager get moments in that episode. But I think the kind of concept is the star of the show with that one. And in a lot of Trek, that's often the case. I think the hook is often the science fiction idea behind whatever the story is that might grab somebody and go, "Wow, that's a cool idea. I've never seen anything quite like that before." So I think that works well, or could work well. And then my Enterprise pick here with the heavy hitters that I haven't quite gotten yet in my lineup either is another kind of is a moral dilemma that's designed to get people talking the way that you were kind of talking about Yesterday's Enterprise. What would I do? How would I handle this? And I'm going to go with Dear Doctor for Enterprise. I think that's got such a polarizing issue. People can sit and watch that, whether they're completely hooked or not. I think it's impossible to watch that and not be presented with like such a direct question that it's going to spark a conversation that people are going to agree or disagree with. And I think that's another key element of Trek, like having something to talk about when it's over. It's not just something you watch, and it's not bubblegum that you just spit out and it's kind of over and you leave it behind. Sometimes it is, but the best of Star Trek definitely inspires deeper conversations and diving into some heftier topics. And Dear Doctor's got a kind of a whimsical tone, seeing it through Phlox's eyes, which kind of makes it a little bit of a unique choice. It's kind of very singular in terms of the perspective you're seeing it through. But he's such a warm and kind of an endearing character that I think it might lend itself well to like bringing somebody in. It's not cold and calculated. It's very warm and humanist, and I think it's a different flavor than things like Duet and Blink of an Eye, especially. Leading into it, it's a little bit. You think it's warmer when it starts because he's kind of silly and goofy, and you get some humor through his like narration and his letter writing, and seeing life on the Enterprise through his eyes. And I talk a lot about, I like when Star Trek does day in the life kinds of things, and I think that's another kind of key thing, that this is a real place that people live in, and it's not just crisis after crisis. And Dear Doctor kind of does that too, but you think it kind of lures you into thinking it's going to be kind of like that, and by the end you're like, what the heck? You're left with some really heavy things to kind of reckon with. So I wanted to have at least one in here that was that brand of Trek that would start the conversation and get people hopefully maybe excited about Trek through those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, that's a great pick, and I think that you could almost go Tuvix here too. But like, I feel like this it feels more warm and easier to kind of wade into kind of those, because I think there are a handful of these types of episodes like Tuvix, like Dear Doctor, like it's like a heavily argued, like at least on Trek Twitter and Trek fandom, like there's very heavily argued these types of episodes. So I think this is a better choice than maybe Tuvix because of Phlox's delivery and how he kind of the warm wading into something like this.
Dear Doctor also is kind of like your classic. If you're looking to kind of in your introductory marathon talk about the Prime Directive and like what it is and why it works, Dear Doctor is kind of the intentional like tee up of that. Like, well, what it kind of perfectly, I would think, like the conversations that would start as a result of the end of Dear Doctor would lead into, well, this is what Trek does. And this is what the Prime Directive's for, and we're often put in these positions where we have to make these kinds of decisions, and the wisdom or the the disagreement with the Prime Directive as a concept and as a mission statement is an interesting thing to kind of bat around too. So, and Tuvix is probably the more polarizing and interesting conversation to have on the merits, because it's two characters. But I think without the background of like who is Tuvok and who is Neelix,
Yeah,
it maybe doesn't work quite as well for like
Sure.
somebody who hasn't seen it. It does. I mean, you
Yeah.
get a little bit of Tuvok and Neelix in the very, very beginning, but I think having some Voyager run up to that might work best and get the most out of that episode. Where Dear Doctor, I think, is such a standard Star Trek. It starts as such a standard Star Trek concept. We get to this planet, people are sick. What do we do? And it turns into this giant mess of morality having to be spilled around and batted around as a debate. Before we get into our personal picks, we have a pretty lively chat. We have Grin Salem, who we mentioned earlier. Jeff is in the chat as well. Rob popped in, kind of following along, talking about their choices, episodes that they really like, as go-tos and personal picks. Grin Salem mentions episodes like Parallels from TNG, Mortal Coil from Voyager, Context is for Kings from Discovery. Jeff's got Broken Bow, Corbin Might Maneuver, Balance of Terror. Yesterday's Enterprise is on his, among others. But the chat's loaded with episodes getting tossed around as interesting, conversation points for this kind of concept. So really glad to see people here and sharing their thoughts and choices. We appreciate you a lot. What do you got for your personal picks? Kind of final to end up your lineup.
Personal picks. It feels really on brand, at least for this morning. I feel like it's time travel. Let's go City on the Edge of Forever.
Okay.
Again, this is where we're deep into the lineup. We're potentially in the second or third inning. At this point, people have the person has seen a little bit more of Trek. He can get on board with different types of medians and times, and so we're back in 1966 here. And then I'm gonna go with kind of like just a complete 180. I'm gonna do Context is for Kings.
Ooh, okay.
I wanted to do something newer.
Yeah.
2017, but
sure.
It almost is like a second pilot for the show.
It is.
Because I think the 2 hours before this, I think, are really good and can also be made a case to be maybe on this list. But I think it's just a perfect representation of the show, at least for the first season. And it just builds kind of where Burnham's going to be and where she's going to potentially end up, and it's really good. And then the last one is going to be tough, but I'm going to go Kobayashi from Prodigy.
Prodigy, nice. I love
it. Which is cool. It's definitely deep in the lineup, and I think at this point, this person can handle a change to animation. But I think it's a really good, I don't know, just explanation of Star Trek and what it means to be in Star Trek and things like that. So these are definitely more of are definitely going to need some more explanation.
Sure.
I think, especially where does Discovery take place in the timeline? Who are these? These aren't our true core characters that we've seen. Even in pop culture, I think people know who Spock is. People know who Picard is. People know who Data is. I think with some of these, it's not our normal people, and it's a normal time, and so these personal picks are definitely you're going to have some more knowledge of Star Trek before you dive into the later end of the lineup. So. Those are my personal picks of starting someone who's new to Trek. So
I love it. I think that's a really nice mix. I'm obviously not going to argue with City on the Edge of Forever. I think that works well as an intro because you really don't need to know anything. I think the sweeping, I've talked about this many times over the years, the sweeping nature of starting on the bridge of the Enterprise and 15 minutes later being in 1930s New York and kind of a love story, kind of a situation is something that only Trek can so smoothly and easily do. And, I think I've often made the case, like the reason that I always have it at the top of my list is, I think you'll learn a lot about Star Trek through that. And I'm saying that I don't have it on my list. It didn't make my cut. I have some other things that I went with, and I don't know why I could have gone with this as my in my intro materials for the reasons I'm about to talk about. But the fact that Edith Keeler is a woman who's out of time and has a sensibility that is more representative of the Star Trek future as the thing that kind of intrigues Kirk and is the sort of lane through which Kirk falls in love with her, tells you a lot of what you need to know about what Star Trek is and why it's special and why it's different than other science fiction. I think it does work as an introductory kind of avenue to look at Trek. So I think it's a valid choice on all three of these levels. I think the kind of emotional pull of it makes it a personal choice for people who really love it. It works as an intro for those reasons I just mentioned, and it's obviously a heavy hitter. So it really fits in all three of these possible lanes, and I can't believe I didn't choose it. Maybe I just get tired of talking about it because it's my favorite. It's always at the top of my list. But I love that it's here and that you picked it. Context is for Kings. I kind of off the beaten path of my actual rewatch. Watched that last night. Not gonna lie, or maybe it was Friday night. I think it was actually. But this weekend, I just recently watched that again, and it does work as like a second pilot. It kind of resets the show and introduces the show as it's going to be. The 2-episode premiere is kind of a different thing and doesn't tee up what Discovery proper kind of winds up being as much as Context is for Kings does. And so for that, it being like the intro to the modern version of Trek, I think it's a really good thing to consider. And Kobayashi does really kind of get to the core of like, well, what does it mean to be a captain? What does it mean to be on a ship and have a crew? And kind of stumbling through, like, it's not just about you, it's about your crew and your family and the people that are with you and leaning into them and not being selfish and doing it for personal gain or your own feel-good reasons. Kobayashi is about all those things, and what's more Star Trek than that? So, and it has like characters from episodes that you've cited up to that point appear in it. Like you see Uhura, you see Spock, you see Scotty, you see Odo, and Dr. Crusher. So people that if you're going through this lineup, the seeing those characters pop in are people that will mean something to that person, or at least be familiar faces, at least.
And that's kind of my hope, is like that's also a mark of Star Trek, where it's like us as longtime fans look for that in, and then the creatives also try to put some of that stuff in. So it's just like it's kind of like the trying to introduce into like fan servicey stuff, but also like learn about Star Trek in it. So I think it's a really good episode to have on everybody's list.
Yeah, agreed. Just to kind of wrap this up, I'll put mine in here. I went with The Offspring as well for a personal choice. I think, again, just the emotional, heavy-hitting nature of that, it makes it, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's a parent, somebody who is one to be emotionally triggered by the content that they watch. I think The Offspring is one that's really tough not to be so affected. I think it tells you a lot about Data as a character. I think it tees him up as an intriguing entry point for maybe why you'd want to continue to see more of him as one of Star Trek's most famous and probably most successful characters. And it speaks to me. It's something that I could talk about why I love it as much as I do. I've mentioned before that it's the Picard moment of standing up for Data is as important to me as just about anything else in it. I think it represents my love of Star Trek as well, and that's why I have it in personal picks. Another episode that I've always loved and kind of advocated for as just a bad A, just example of Star Trek when it's being really cool and action-packed is Deadlock from Voyager. Another, just in terms of the cool science fiction of it, it's like jagged-edged and urgent and scary and high stakes. It's doing things that kind of only Star Trek can do, with using its science fiction concepts and having the duplicate idea, the twisty turny nature of it, the things that Janeway is willing to do for her crew, the ensemble of it. I think all the characters get cool little moments in it. Harry Kim's great in it. Kess is cool in it. They're just great moments throughout, and it's just tense. Like I think it's never lets up for the 45 minutes, and it kicks off really quickly. So, a lot of the episodes I've chosen up to this point are a little more heady, maybe a little less action heavy, which is a little alarming to me. When I'm looking back at it, I'm like, man, I don't know, is this too talky, too intellectually aimed, as opposed to like the other side of Trek? Well, my last couple episodes are more aimed at the action, and I maybe can make a case that flipping them around might make for a better flow to give some variety. But Deadlock's a big favorite of mine for that flavor of Trek. And my last one, I did want to pick something modern other than '09. And Contexts for Kings, Kobayashi are great choices. Time of Mock is something from Prodigy that I thought a lot about. Wage Douche I thought about. But again, I get hung up on like what works for people coming in without really having to know anything and works on its own. And I ended up going with Memento Mori from Strange New Worlds as kind of just a lean, mean submarine movie in space that kind of stands on its own as just an action piece with some effective drama as well, some good character work. Would hopefully, but I think stands as like what's the best of like what this current iteration, this current era of Trek able to do, that somebody could just pop into and see. A Quality of Mercy, some of the Picard stuff this season. Various episodes of Discovery, obviously, I think are tremendous, examples of great Star Trek. But I often would end up looking at episodes that I love from those various shows and kind of steering away because I just don't know how well they work as like a individual drop-in point. Where I think Memento Mori works really well as kind of like a TOS episode in the way that Strange New Worlds is kind of setting out to do. You don't need much background on it. You can just kind of pop it down and stumble into it, and you don't really need to know much else. What you need to know is shown on screen in that hour. So that's my one example of the current era of Trek that I kind of finish off with as like a, hey, if you want to keep going, this is what you get to. Like, this is out there too. This other, kind of chapter of Star Trek that's running now. This is like the best of that.
Yeah, it's like the I don't know. It's Star Trek to its core, but it's like the highest production value. This is like the what we get to, what you can get to if you watch from the very beginning to now. It's just, yeah, really good pick. That was probably one of my toughest cuts. Because like you said, some of these shows, like it's tough to kind of get, like the best thing about them is just because how it changes past episodes, but also because what we see before. So it's really tough to some of these new stuff. Besides like picking technically an earlier episode that you haven't really seen much. So
right.
Yeah, no, that's a really good pick, and I think Strange New Worlds, I think, is probably going to be this show that I think really
works.
Is. If I'm going to point to one of these newer shows, besides maybe Kobayashi, or not Kobayashi, but Prodigy,
yeah,
I think is really a good jumping off point for a casual fan that kind of has a basic knowledge of Star Trek.
I would agree. I think Discovery actually surprisingly works pretty well too as an intro. Like if you just started with Discovery and you kind of roll with it and embrace the fact that you are jumping into a franchise that's got some history, I think Discovery is underratedly strong for somebody who might not have a great deal of preordained knowledge. And in some ways, I think it almost makes it easier. If you don't come in with the baggage of 50 years of knowing Spock already and having to make that leap of who Michael Burnham is and how she fits into the Sarek family, like somebody who's coming in more raw, that's not going to have the same, heavy lift that people might have had to get over. The way the Klingons look in the beginning of the show, like things like that aren't gonna be the challenging entry points that they were for some folks. But I totally agree. I think Prodigy and Strange New Worlds are the obvious entry points for folks of the new shows. You know, Picard obviously really relies heavily on, you know, knowledge of the Next Generation, and even Deep Space Nine and Voyager at this point. It's really the sequel to the 24th century shows.
Yeah.
It doesn't work super well as an entry point. That's one of two shows that's not on either one of our lists, that and Lower Decks. And I think Lower Decks, similarly, you know, if Lower Decks is going to work for you, it's so reliant on, you know, clever and really, really smart kind of inside jokes a lot of the time that I don't know, you know, how well. I've heard anecdotally that it does work better than I think it does. And I'm glad to hear that. How it works for folks that don't know a lot about Trek is kind of why I ended up leaving that off my list. But Discovery, Prodigy, Strange New Worlds, and all of the legacy shows made these lists in some ways or others. So I thought this was really fun. I really enjoyed looking at this. Do you have any, like you mentioned Memento Mori, any late cuts, any things that you really, really wanted to include that you just couldn't find a way in, or
Similitude, I think. That was a tough, like, moral dilemma one.
Yeah.
I don't think I have an Enterprise, and so that's the one where I was trying to, like, I think it's really uniquely Enterprise, but it's also like it's got that Star Trek morality. Like, okay, what would I do in this situation?
Yeah.
And then Memento Mori was my other top cut too, because it's like a modern day like TOS episode.
It is.
It's
for sure, absolutely. Yeah. Similitude fits right in with like Dear Dr. Tuvix. That kind of it really presents you with like a clear cut this or that, like which, you know, what would you do? Those kinds of questions, and there's lots of Star Trek episodes that end up doing that, maybe in sometimes less pointed ways, and maybe aren't as like dramatically hinging on specifically that choice at the end of the day. But it's certainly I think it's a good instinct to include something like that because it is such a flavor of Star Trek. But I think we, between our two lists, we've really touched on different genres, different kinds of Star Trek, different iterations, different flavors, and that's really encouraging. And I think that kind of backs up the mission statement of this episode of Trek Live to look at this kind of thing and think about what works well as an entry point for Star Trek. So. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. I think that was a cool, different idea. I'm really big on things like the fantasy draft, and this as you know, we can have conversations all day long and change our lists and do things like what are your favorite this or that. Trek Ranks does an amazing job of that. If you're looking for a good Star Trek podcast and somehow haven't stumbled on that yet, that's the best, the cream of the crop for name your favorite, you know, fill in the blank kind of discussion. But I really like finding different ways to, you know, create rules or guidelines around, you know, what to cite, whether it's through like the fantasy draft where there's a competitive element to that choosing, or something like this where there's a specific kind of ask that you're looking for. So we'll keep finding ways to do that. Real quick, in these last couple minutes, how you feeling about Picard so far? We've got 3 episodes to go. I know it's really hard to like sum it up in a couple minutes. We're well over an hour at this point. A couple minutes into
tough.
An hour. But what are your thoughts on 6 and 7?
I think it's really strong. I think the last episode maybe felt like a lateral step a little bit, maybe muddied the water a little bit. As far as I know, that's kind of taboo to talk about because we're coming off such a heater to kind of keep it in baseball terms here. But no, I think it's going really, really well. I think you know, even this last episode, it's really sparking a lot of good conversation online. And again, it there is some morality in there as well. as far as 6 and 7. But no, I think it just keeps on chugging. This is a really strong season. And I think I don't know if I talked about this on Trek Live here, but Bill and I talked about Terry Metalis, who's like one of the writers on this season. Showrunner, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Has like ties back to kind of like the 90s era Berman era Trek, and it's just so many things just click of how beautifully written this is, and how beautifully this season is taken. Like Bill said, like it's not even really a TNG reunion show. It's more like a continuation of the 24th century, which I think it's just perfect.
Yeah. No, I mentioned on Twitter a couple days ago the same thing I've said here, and like it was kind of a really perfect accident to be in the middle of the Next Generation watching this, because of how it really sells, I think, how just naturally a progression it is. And there's been a lot of talk about the debate that Picard and Crusher were having in sickbay in the last episode about what to do with who they had behind that force field, and people having different ideas about like what the right thing is, and should they even be entertaining what they were talking about. And my thing is like, it's been 30 years or whatever, and the fact that we're seeing those two characters have that kind of discussion about those kinds of issues in 2023 is good enough for me. I'm all for that. I can't believe they're actually doing it. I can't believe I'm watching those two actors talk about meaty, like, moral dilemma kinds of things in 2023. And I was hooked for it. I believe it. I mean, I believe that they would be torn. I believe that I believed both kind of sides of the argument. I thought it was a well-honed moral dilemma. I don't know what the right choice is, as I often end up coming down on a lot of these. I don't know. I'm glad I'm not the one having to make these calls. I can see both sides. The other thing that I really want to throw out there from the last episode that genuinely surprised me and got me was, they kind of led us to believe that Brent Spiner was playing Lore, and kind of left it simply he's playing Lore. And a lot of things have been kind of teased and alluded to, and it ended up being like, oh, we thought that, and it ends up being true. This felt like an actual surprise. Like when we realized who he is and what it is, and got the extra nuance there. I think that was a really pleasant surprise and really cool, and it fits perfectly into the season. Like, it's all about the next generation and leaving, children and trying to, leave something better in what's coming after you. And that's exactly what this, android entity is. Putting all of these soon creations together in hopes that it'll be like a better version of what came before, which is human nature, right? Like, I'm glad I didn't know that coming in. I'm glad I was surprised by that in the reveal on Daystrom Station. That was a pleasant surprise.
Because I thought Brent Spiner said it was complicated.
Yeah, they did. They did keep saying that.
Which it's the truth.
It was, yeah. And I'm glad, I think preserving the reveal and the surprise of it is one thing, but I also think letting us discover it within the context of the season and having built on these themes and what the season's about gave it the most oomph, rather than just telling us that last summer. Oh, he's playing, an Android version with all these, with B4 and Data and Lore and Lal and, Alton Soong all dumped into him. Like, all those things kind of thrown together in a soup. I think that would have been cool to hear, but it wouldn't have had the same kind of surprise and emotional punch as it did finding it the way Riker and Worf did, and Rafi.
That's like the old adage, like, show us, don't tell us.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And they kind of preserved that. In some way, like, there were things that they haven't been able to do that with, but this, they did. And people talk about it. I totally loved the little beat on the bridge with seeing the old ships at the Starship Museum and hearing Seven talk about Voyager. Like, I thought that was really, really good. In the last episode, episode 6, The Bounty, really leans heavily into the nostalgia and the sort of emotional ties to what came before. I think LeVar Burton's great in both of these episodes. Seeing him again, he's kind of one of the last. Him and Brent Spiner and Marina Sirtis are kind of the last elements of the cast kind of being reintroduced here, and I think LeVar Burton's been really impressive in both episodes with really emotional performance. And yeah, it's great. I agree. I think episode 7 might be my least favorite of the season, but that's, faint criticism because the season's so phenomenal, and it's certainly a successful episode of Star Trek. Might not be my personal favorite. I think it's a little jagged in its structure. I think it feels a little. I suspect that there's a lot cut in that. I just felt like maybe it was a little rushed at times, and I feel like there's a longer cut of it somewhere that I'd be interested to see. But Amanda Plummer also excellent as Vadic. I think she's wild and crazy, and there's a lot of fascinating backstory to her that I'm sure we'll talk more about. We're going to do a wrap up of the season in a couple weeks when this is all done, so we won't be trying to cram, thoughts into the last couple minutes of these shows. But I'm all on board. We only have a few left. I can't believe it's already almost over. These 10 episode seasons fly by way too fast, and that's certainly true here. All right.
Yeah, all good stuff.
Yep. All right, we're well past an hour. We appreciate the really lively chat. Grin Salem ran off. She hasn't seen Picard season 3 yet and didn't want to be spoiled, so well done. Good choice. But I appreciate you stopping by, coming back, and joining us again after all these years. And Jeff and Rob, very active in the chat. Jimmy77 also, I see, who was a frequent watcher in the past. Really great to see an active chat and some enthusiasm for the topic. Lots of episodes being shared. Be interested to see, as Dan always says at the end of these, discussion doesn't have to stop here. There's Twitter, there's our Discord server. If you have your own starting 9, we'd love to hear it. Share it in the comments below of this YouTube video, or join us on Twitter or on our Discord server. If you're interested in joining our Discord server, you can send me a DM on Twitter at TrekFan4387 and ask for an invitation. I'll get it to you. It's a very modest but active, positive, upbeat server. It's accessible. You're not going to get dropped into a soup of conversation that is hard to catch up on. It's a convenient place to get to know other Star Trek fans and talk about what you're watching, reading, learning, whatever, in the world of Trek.
Yep, I want to thank everybody for watching. Really, really fun topics coming up. I think this is a really good batch of topics. But yeah, thank everybody for watching. The chat was amazing today, and we will see you in a couple weeks.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back. Take care.